Welcome back, everybody, to WWTA News. Thank you for joining us again to, I guess, just conversate about what's going on in the news. So today we're going to go into some stuff I've been picking up off Bloomberg about the economy. Very important stuff that we should probably discuss. And I'll jump to the first article. It says early rate hikers hit jackpot as local bonds trounce the dollar debt. Emerging market central banks were the first in the world to raise interest rates from their pandemic lows last year. That proactive tightening is starting to pay off big time in boosting returns for their local bonds. So the local debt forged in the bonds contracts is paying off, right? So as these nations are beginning to lift or increase the interest rates, which we saw this coming when they were talking about it last month, as they begin to raise the interest rates, it's beginning to send the investors, I would say, into picking up the debt bonds of the nation, right? So you start thinking about the debt bonds. It's like, okay, well, if they're increasing the interest rate, then most people aren't going to want to let go of what they have, so they're going to struggle to make those payments because they want to keep their cars, their homes. They've got credit card debts and all these different debts that come from banks and so on and so forth. So they're not going to want to lose that. So the investor would look at that and say, well, I guess I'll start picking up those national debt bonds or those local debt bonds. And so from that, you begin to see an increase. I guess that's what they're trying to direct us to, is that the dollar debt, based on the debts, is going to increase in value. Those bonds, those debts are going to increase in value, so there's a potential to gain money from that. But on the larger scale, we have to look at as the Fed begins to increase the interest rates across the board, you'll see positive and negative, and the potential there is just, well, before we get into that potential, we'd have to look at the whole big picture. And before we look at the whole big picture, we should probably just go through the news. But, I just want to share that article right there. Let's see. Continuing with that article, it says the outperformance for local bonds has become amid optimism. The proactive central bank policy was enough for them to get ahead of inflation and should mean that further tightening is now less necessary into 2022. Improving economic conditions as the global recovery gets underway are also attracting investors to look at that. Right. So again, obviously they're attracting investors to get that local debt. But when you look at it, they're talking about the central banks, right? So it's a lot of stuff going on with central banks. Central banks trying to make a central bank digital currency. The central bank is the ones that were printing that money and then making the banks liquid by buying up those bonds for them. So now you have these national secured bonds that the central bank had purchased for the treasury. So then you look at that and you say, okay, well, we know where the bonds are, right? So then we're talking about the local bonds, the bonds of the nation. Then we look ahead at the whole concept of inflation. And so the dollar being inflated based on how many times the Fed or the central bank has chopped up the actual amount of value into these dollars that they've printed, right? So you say, okay, well, if you really don't have that many and you're just cutting up the amount of value you have and producing more liquidity that you can put out into the world, so there's where your inflation comes from. You know what I'm saying? So, and again, there's a lot entailed with all that because there's a lot of things happening inside. It's like a perfect storm. I know you hear a lot of people talk about that, but they're telling you there's a perfect storm of brewing. And so we're just looking at one story so far where they're basically saying that they're increasing the interest rates, but they're hoping that this will slow inflation, but they're admitting that yes, there's inflation. They just didn't tell you why there's inflation. That's basically because they were printing the money based on the value of assets that they have as the United States, as a nation. But that does not include the assets that the citizens hold per se, unless those assets are held by brokerages or firms. Then 9/10 are lost possession, and so that can go everywhere. We'll leave that alone. So let's just continue. All right, another article: mortgage rates surge to levels not seen since early days of the pandemic. Other new research shows the higher borrowing cost, which most experts say will only continue heading north as the economy improves, are prompting borrowers to lock in today's mortgage rates that are still low by historical standards. So again, we knew about this, we knew this was coming. So as the interest rate is increasing, the interest rate's increasing, you're seeing people say, oh, well, if I want to buy a house, I better hurry up and buy it now and lock in at a good interest rate before the interest rate goes sky high, because everybody's worried about the interest rate going sky high. And obviously, you printed out all this money, you put all this money into the system. Now you have to get something back to match that money so that you can stand firm on your debts, because right now you just have a lot of loans out and you're not really receiving anything. So that's where you start looking at investors getting into the let me buy up some of this national bonds, or essentially national debt. So they start picking it up and like, okay, well, I got my share of it. And you look at the Fed and the central banks, and they're like, oh, well, they're okay with it because this is helping balance in some degree, because we're all waiting to get paid back these debts, this money owed on these debts. So as citizens of the United States accruing all this debt, the debt still has to be paid. You can't just turn around and walk away from the debt, because that's a big part of what the Fed or central bank was buying up when they were printing out that money and making these banks liquid. So when you look at the big picture there, there is a reason why people that have the ability to buy homes, that want to get into a newer home or a better home or a larger home, whatever the case may be is going on in their life, they're looking at it and they're saying right now is going to be the best time, because it looks like the Fed is going to continue to increase these rates. All right. Next article: Treasuries slump resumes as Fed rate hike bets ramp up. Investors are increasingly concerned that elevated U.S. inflation will force the Fed to tighten policy faster than expected, with swaps markets pricing in 425 basis point hikes within a year. Billionaire investor Bill Ackman has argued for a 50 basis point move in March, while Fed Governor Christopher Waller said there may be even as many as 5 hikes this year, depending on the inflation. So because, again, the big picture, because they chopped up the value that they have, printed out money, gave it to the banks. Well, they didn't really give it to the banks. They made the banks liquid by buying up their debts and bonds, and then making those national bonds or local debt bonds. Because they did that, they started to increase or hasten the inflation. And so we see inflation, the value of everything, increasing, and it's like, okay, well, what are they going to do to fix this? So here their suggestions, they're already up 25 basis points, and they're suggesting they should be up 50 basis points in March. So with everybody looking at that, people that have loans or debts, a lot of them that are looking at this information are probably paying their debts off. They're probably not playing around. They probably didn't try to incur no debts during these holidays. They were probably paying off credit card debts and everything else in preparedness for what's coming down the line. You got to remember, during the pandemic, a lot, and before the pandemic, let's go before the pandemic, they were having those overnight bailouts, quote unquote, where they were buying up the debt bonds of the banks and making the banks liquid. This was happening prior to the pandemic. During the pandemic, a lot of activities happened. A lot of money was printed and dispersed in different directions. And so it's time to pay the bill. So everybody, the banks and the citizens as a whole, all of us here as United States citizens that took part in these activities, we essentially sat at the table, we had a good meal, and we were like, it's on credit, I don't have to pay it right now. So it's like, oh yeah, you filled up, you feel good, your stomach feels good, you don't have to come back and pay later. We'll charge it. We'll essentially charge it, and you can just make payments on it because you ate good, right? If you participated. So that really shows that it wasn't just the government that played a part in this inflation. It was the United States as a whole, including citizens, corporations, small businesses, so on and so forth. And so that's what we're looking at now. And this is why the whole situation is getting scary. And this is why you look at the housing market, and it's a seller's market right now, because they know people are scared. They're going to try to make those purchases now. And going into the future, what we're going to see after these hikes, maybe March, April, May, probably April, May, June, we're probably going to start seeing the prices of houses go down, because it's going to start becoming a buyer's market, because people are going to be scared, not going to have money. They're going to be dealing with too many debts on their backs to go out and purchase homes. So the housing market might begin to really fall down again. So that's something to look forward to, if you're looking to buy a home. All right. We got another article here. China to curb purchases of U.S. farm goods, Fitch Solutions says. China may continue to limit soybean and other agricultural purchases from the United States as geopolitical tensions persist. The research company said in a note, Brazil will be a winner with its share in the Chinese market poised to stay elevated and could rise further for some commodities such as meat and cotton. Even though China has bought record amounts of United States farm goods in recent years, partly due to a trade deal signed in January 2020, and mainly because of mass expansion in its hog herd, relations between the world's two biggest economies have deteriorated. Tensions flared over Hong Kong, Taiwan, human rights, the origins of the COVID-19 pandemic, and many other flashpoints. So this isn't the first time we hear about trade deals not going good. We've known trade deals haven't been good for a while. We know trade deals have gotten ugly with other nations as well. So this really brings us to the fact that store shelves are empty. Americans are seeing empty shelves at grocery stores. So now it's not been new. It's not a new thing. You got to remember, more rural areas, they weren't being serviced as much as more populated areas, because we were already having an issue from the pandemic, and even before the pandemic, with the situation with the dollar's value, the inflation, the fact that other nations were tired of dealing with the United States using their hold of the reserve currency, using that to force nations into submission. A lot of nations have been getting tired of that. We also saw a lot of nations were saying that they didn't believe that the actual dollar had any value because of all the debt, and so a lot of reasons had already caused prior a lot of nations to back away from the dollar, which started to cause problems with trade, incoming, outgoing, so on and so forth. So a lot of counties and states and different areas were already seeing the empty shelves. Now it's becoming more prevalent in more populated areas. People are now seeing what people have been saying for months on out, even years, that hey man, these store shelves are getting empty, man. Like, oh, but they're conspiracy theorists. And I know people say that all the time, but these people were actually looking around and paying attention. And so when you go in the stores, depending on where you are, some of you might still see shelves that are full and highly stocked. It might be the area that you're in, and the companies deciding that these areas are where they make the most money, so try to keep a lot of foods and goods in these particular stores, and that would just be business, as they would start to shrink the amounts going to other locations. It's no different than when you see a lot of these fast food restaurants that have been closing down and their buildings becoming empty, and a lot of other businesses closing down. So you got a few things striving right now, small businesses, like mom and pops that are still they're able to survive because they're not under the pressures of these big companies that have massive amounts of loans. Again, when we talk about these bank bailouts, these banks were also holding these loans to these businesses as well. So everybody right now in the United States is about to suffer, if they're not already suffering, from all the joy we had during the pandemic time, all that eating we did, and now we're seeing it. We're seeing the shelves being empty from poor trade. We're seeing the inflation of the dollar, and what good is the dollar when you don't have things on shelves to purchase, right? So with all that being said, there's a lot going on in the United States that we should pay more attention to. We should definitely understand that not everybody's going to be able to keep up with their debts. You start increasing these interest rates, you're going to have a lot of people forfeiting or not being able to compete, or not compete, but to pay their debts. So you're going to see a lot of people possibly losing homes, which is going to flood the market with homes for sale, right? And possibly homes for rent. Depends, You're going to see a lot of people failing to pay debts that might end up putting them in the bracket of garnishments, and you're going to see different peoples or different branches of whether it be governments, city, states, locals, feds, starting to garnish to get their debt back. Because you got to remember, now, for those of you who don't know, do not think that you will never get garnished for a debt. The city can do it, the state can do it, the county can do it, the federal government definitely can and does do it. So any of these debts can be garnished, and then a lot of these companies that still have to pay their debts, they'll be ready to take the common person to court to see if they can get a garnishment on their check for any debts that they're holding, because they still got to pay their debts. So it's going to become ugly as they continue to increase this interest rate. And we all need to be prepared and thinking about, how are we going to go forward? Do we have an actual currency that we can stand on that is of value, that we'll be able to trade for the resolve of these debts and things like that? These are things we should be thinking about. So anyways, that's what I have, just in some of this economic news, especially here in the United States, and some of the things that we should be thinking about. If you like the video, you know what to do. Hit the like button. You can subscribe to the channel, and you can also hit that bell for notification.